The morning Clara Reed drove a borrowed plow into Harlan Brooks's untilled south field, she already knew he was going to be furious, and she had decided she did not care one single bit. It was the spring of 1874, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came down from the caprock with enough force to push a grown man sideways, and where the sky stretched so wide and so blue that newcomers sometimes felt dizzy just looking up at it. The town of Caldwell Crossing sat at the junction of two cattle trails, a modest collection of sun-bleached buildings that included a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Dusty Spur, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a collection of homesteads spreading outward from the main road like fingers reaching for water. The land was not generous, not by any reasonable measure, but it was honest, and Clara Reed had learned long ago to respect honesty wherever she found it. She had arrived in Caldwell Crossing 8 months earlier with a wagon, a mule named Gerald, 3 trunks of her late mother's belongings, and a deed to 40 acres that her father had left her when fever took him the previous autumn. People in town had been polite enough, which in the Panhandle meant they did not say unkind things directly to her face. But she had seen the looks exchanged when she walked into the general store to buy seed corn and fencing wire, heard the low murmur that followed her down the road when she drove her wagon alone, without a husband beside her, and without a brother to lean on. A woman alone with land was considered either a tragedy or a curiosity, and the people of Caldwell Crossing had not yet decided which category Clara Reed fit. She was 26 years old, brown-haired and steady-eyed, with hands that had known work since she was old enough to follow her father into the garden. She was not soft, but she was not hardened either. There was a quality about her that people noticed without being able to name precisely, a kind of quiet insistence, as though the world could push her, and she would simply plant her feet a little wider and continue. Harlan Brooks, on the other hand, was the kind of man people in Caldwell Crossing did name and name often. He owned the largest parcel of land in the county, 320 acres that ran along Cottonwood Creek, with a main house that was proper timber construction rather than sod, a working barn, 2 bunkhouses for the hands he hired during cattle season, and a reputation for being the most capable and the most stubborn rancher in the region. He was 32, broad-shouldered, dark-haired with a few threads of early gray at his temples, and he wore his feelings the way most men in the Panhandle wore their hats, pulled down low, tilted against the wind, not easily removed. His wife, Annabelle, had died 3 years prior, of a fever that swept through the county one brutal summer and spared no one who was already weakened. They had been married 4 years. He had buried her under the cottonwood at the northeast corner of the property, and some people in town said he had not been truly present since, that he walked around and worked and spoke and managed his affairs, but something essential had gone out of him and had not come back. Clara did not know enough about him, yet to judge whether that was true, or merely the kind of story small towns told to make sense of a quiet man. What she did know was that his south field bordered her property along a shared fence line, and that the field had not been worked in 2 seasons. She knew this because she had asked around carefully, and because she had eyes that worked perfectly well. The land was going to waste. Rich, black creek-bottom soil that could grow enough corn to sustain a family through 3 hard winters was sitting untilled, the weeds taking hold again, the soil cracking in the dry March air. Her own land, the 40 acres, was already running her ragged. She had managed to get the northeast section plowed and planted before the last frost, fighting Gerald every step of the way, because the mule had opinions about the direction of travel and was not afraid to share them. But she was running short on time and shorter on strength, and the south section of her property, the 10 acres that shared a fence with Harlan's fallow field, was still untouched. The idea came to her the way most of Clara's ideas came to her, quietly, practically, without dramatic ceremony. She would offer to work Harlan's south field in exchange for the use of his better equipment and his stronger draft horse. She would plow his land and her remaining 10 acres in one long push, and both parties would benefit. It was a fair arrangement. It was logical. It was the kind of agreement neighbors had been making since before the Republic of Texas. She had ridden over to the main house at the Brooks property 2 weeks earlier to propose exactly this. Harlan Brooks had listened to her proposal from the porch steps, hat in hand, turning it slowly by the brim the way men did when they were choosing their words with some care. He was not unkind about it. He was simply, firmly, and completely unmovable. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Reed," he had said, and his voice had that particular low quality that seemed to come from somewhere in the chest rather than the throat. "But I cannot have a woman working my land. It would not be right." Clara had kept her expression entirely neutral. "Who decides what is right, Mr. Brooks? You or the land?" He had looked at her then, really looked, as though she had said something that required processing. Then he had put his hat back on. "I manage my own affairs." "I thank you for the offer." She had driven home, sat on her porch step in the gathering dark, watched Gerald crop at the dry grass with his usual expression of total indifference to human concerns, and thought about it. Then she had made her decision. She was not going to ask again. She was not built for asking twice when she already knew the answer was wrong. So on the morning of March the 14th, 1874, while Harlan Brooks was 2 hours north of his property at the cattle auction in Marvell Flats, Clara Reed drove a borrowed plow, and Gerald the mule through the gap in the fence line that she had deliberately widened the evening before, positioned herself at the far south end of his fallow field, and began to plow. The soil was exactly what she had thought it was. Rich and dark and cooperative once you broke through the top crust, the kind of soil that practically begged for seed. Gerald, to his credit, was in one of his better moods that morning, plodding along with steady if unenthusiastic purpose. Clara worked with her head down and her shoulders squared, row after row, turning the earth up in long dark curls, the smell of fresh broken ground rising around her like something holy. She had been at it 3 hours when she heard the hoofbeats. She did not stop plowing. She adjusted her grip on the handles, clicked her tongue at Gerald to maintain pace, and kept her eyes forward on the row she was cutting. She heard the horse slow behind her, heard it stop, heard the particular silence of a rider who has pulled up short because he cannot quite believe what his eyes are telling him. Then she heard his voice. "What in the Miss Reed?" It was not entirely a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he has run out of room for questions. "Mr. Brooks," she said pleasantly, still plowing, "what are you doing on my land, plowing it?" There was a silence long enough for a hawk to cross the field twice. "I told you," I said. "You said you could not have a woman working your land." She reached the end of the row, turned Gerald with practiced efficiency, and started back the other direction, the new furrow running parallel and perfect alongside the last one. "I did not ask your permission this time, so you did not have to say it again. The logic holds up." "That is trespassing," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was working very hard to sound stern while simultaneously being genuinely bewildered. "It is also half done," she said. "I would be grateful if you did not interrupt." She was, in fact, just past the halfway mark on the south field. Roughly 5.5 acres of the 11-acre plot had been turned, the dark rows running straight as ruled lines, the turned earth gleaming in the mid-morning sun. She could feel him behind her, still on his horse, and she could tell from the quality of the silence that he had not yet dismounted. He had, she reflected, a very expressive silence. After a long moment she heard the creak of leather, the soft thud of boots hitting ground. She glanced back once and saw him standing beside his horse, a big roan named Duke who was eyeing Gerald with the mild contempt of a more dignified animal. Harlan's hat was pushed back on his head. He was staring at the plowed field with an expression she could not entirely read from this distance, but it contained something that was not quite anger. "You could have asked again," he said, following her at a distance. His voice had changed register slightly. "You would have said no again. I might have said yes. You would not have, she said, and there was enough confidence in her tone that he did not immediately contradict her. You are a man who means what he says, Mr. Brooks. That is generally an admirable quality. Today it would have meant wasted land and a wasted season, and both of us poorer for it. She heard him let out a long breath. She heard him take up Duke's reins and begin walking alongside her at the edge of the plowed section, watching the work, and she focused on the row ahead and let him come to his own conclusions in his own time. After half an hour, during which she completed 4 more rows and he said nothing at all, he spoke again. You are doing it wrong. Clara stopped walking. Gerald stopped too, with evident relief, and began immediately investigating the ground for anything edible. She turned to look at Harlan Brooks fully for the first time since he had ridden up, and she found him standing with his arms crossed, looking at the angle of her furrows with a critical expression that would have been infuriating on anyone else's face. Wrong how? She asked, keeping her voice level. You are running the rows east to west. The drainage on this field runs south by southeast. Rain runs down and pools at the low end. You want the rows tilted, not straight across. Clara looked at the rows. She looked at the field, she looked at him. Show me, she said. He blinked. Clearly he had expected a different response. Then something shifted in the set of his jaw, not quite softening, but adjusting, the way a door adjusts when someone actually pushes on it correctly. Move over, he said, and he took hold of Gerald's bridle with one hand and the plow handle with the other, and for a moment their hands were both on the worn wooden handle, and Clara felt the heat of his proximity like something physical, like standing too close to a stove in winter. She stepped back and watched him demonstrate the angle, the slight southward tilt of the rows, and she could see immediately that he was right, that the drainage would be better, that the field would hold water more effectively in a dry year. He knew this land the way she was still learning hers, from the inside, from years of watching and working. I see it, she said. He looked up. They were perhaps 4 feet apart and the March wind was moving between them, carrying the smell of turned earth and the distant sweetness of cottonwood. Something crossed his face quickly, something unguarded, and then it was gone. You have good rows otherwise, he said. Straight. That is harder than it looks. It was not exactly a compliment. But it was also not nothing. Thank you, she said. Are you going to help me finish, or are you going to stand there and supervise? He stared at her for another moment. Then he turned toward the barn at the far edge of the property, where his own plow horse, a massive Belgian draft named Solomon, was presumably puzzling over the unexpected day of rest. I will get Solomon, he said, and he was already walking. We will finish faster with 2. Clara watched him go, and she allowed herself, privately in the space between one heartbeat and the next, to feel the particular satisfaction of having been entirely right about something that mattered. They worked side by side through the rest of the morning, Harlan with Solomon and the heavier plow, Clara with Gerald and the borrowed one, the 2 horses and 2 humans cutting rows in steady parallel progress across the remaining field. They did not talk much at first. The work was loud enough, the creak of harness and the rip of turned soil and the wind coming in off the caprock, that conversation would have required shouting, and neither of them was inclined toward shouting. But during a rest break, when the horses were drinking from the trough at the field's edge, and the sun had climbed to its noon position, and was throwing short, hard shadows, Harlan handed her a canteen without being asked and said, How long have you had that mule? Clara took a drink. Gerald was standing 3 feet away regarding her with an expression that suggested he found the entire enterprise beneath his dignity. My father bought him in 1869. He is older than his behavior suggests. Is that him being well-behaved or poorly behaved? Honestly, Clara said, I have not always been certain which is which. Harlan looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at Harlan with the utter, magnificent indifference of a mule who has survived worse. Then Harlan made a sound that Clara realized, with some surprise, was a laugh. Not a big laugh, not the kind that fills a room, but the genuine article, quiet and short and entirely unguarded. It changed his face considerably. She had thought him severe-looking. in the way many men who worked hard outdoors and felt things deeply became severe. But the laugh showed something underneath the severity, something warm and dry like good timber under weather-beaten paint. "What did you do before you came here?" he asked, recapping the canteen. "I kept my father's farm in East Texas outside Nacogdoches. We had corn mostly, some pigs, a kitchen garden. When he died I sold what I could, used the money to get here and filed on my 40. By yourself. My father did not leave me a husband," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just fact. "He left me a deed and good sense and the knowledge that work does not care who is doing it so long as it gets done." Harlan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the far tree line, where the cottonwoods ran along the creek in a ragged green line, and his expression had closed again somewhat. "My father said work was the only honest thing," he said. "He was a hard man, but he was right about that." Clara looked at the half-plowed field. "Did your father build this place?" "Started it. I finished it." A pause. "My wife and I were going to expand it further. The south field was going to be her kitchen garden writ large." He said it carefully, the way you carry something fragile. "She wanted a proper kitchen garden with fruit trees and a well dug close. Said she was tired of hauling water from the creek." Clara said nothing for a moment, letting the information settle without pressing on it. "I am sorry," she said finally, "for your loss." He nodded once briefly in the way men do when they are acknowledging something without fully reopening it. "It has been 3 years," he said, which was not the same as saying he was finished with it. They went back to work. By mid-afternoon the south field was completely plowed, all 11 acres of it, the rows running at the correct angle now, the dark earth ready for seed. Clara walked the finished rows with a feeling that was part pride and part relief, and part something harder to name, some mix of exhaustion and rightness, the satisfaction of seeing a thing through. Harlan was unhitching Solomon from the plow, running a hand along the big horse's flank, murmuring something to him that Clara could not hear. He had his hat off again and the afternoon sun was in his dark hair and he looked in that unguarded moment much younger than 32. "I will help you with your 10 acres, he said without looking up. Clara stopped walking. "I did not ask for that." "I know you did not." He turned to look at her then. His eyes, she noticed for perhaps the 3rd time today, were an unusual shade, not quite brown and not quite green, somewhere in between, the color of the creek in autumn. "You plowed my land. Mine is the debt. That is not why I did it." "I know that either," he said. "But I am offering, because it is fair and because the 10 acres will take you another 2 days alone with that mule, and I have Solomon here who could do it in a morning." Clara considered arguing. She was very good at arguing, but she was also a practical woman, and the logic of Solomon's superiority over Gerald was not genuinely in dispute. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning if the weather holds." "Weather will hold," he said, with the certainty of a man who had read this sky for 30 years. He was right. The morning came in clear and still, with a light that turned the caprock to gold on the eastern rim, and made the whole wide sky feel like something deliberate rather than accidental. Clara was up before sunrise, had Gerald watered and fed, had coffee on the stove and biscuits baked by the time she heard Solomon's hoofbeats coming up the track to her property. Harlan arrived with the big draft horse and a length of new rope she had not asked for and a small paper-wrapped parcel that he held out to her without ceremony when he stepped down from the saddle. "Tomato seeds," he said, "from last year's best ones. Annabelle used to save them." He paused. "They will want a lot of sun. The southeast corner of your kitchen plot would be right." Clara took the parcel carefully. The paper was old and soft, the seeds inside rustling gently with the weight of something carefully preserved for a season. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in more dimensions than the word normally carried. He just nodded and went to get Solomon set up with the plow. They worked Clara's 10 acres together, side by side again in the morning light, and this time they talked more. She learned that he had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Eli and Pete Fogarty, who came every spring for cattle season, and went north to Kansas in the fall to earn winter wages. She learned that he had been in the Panhandle since he was 19, that he had come from Missouri with his father and two older brothers, both of whom had eventually gone back east for reasons that seemed to pain him somewhat. She learned that he could repair almost any piece of farm equipment with what was available in his barn, and that he considered this a necessary skill rather than an impressive one. She told him about Nacogdoches, about her mother who had died when Clara was 14, and who had been, by all accounts, a woman of extraordinary stubbornness who had passed this quality directly to her daughter. She told him about the farm, about learning to plow at 12 because the hired man had quit, and the work did not care about the size of the person doing it. She told him about the decision to come west, which had been frightening and necessary in equal measure, and how she had stood at the edge of her father's grave in the red East Texas clay, and told him out loud that she was going to be all right, and had not entirely believed herself at the time, but had decided to act as though she did until the believing caught up. Harlan listened the way some men listen when they are genuinely interested rather than simply waiting for their turn to speak. He asked questions at the right moments. He did not fill silences unnecessarily. By noon her 10 acres were plowed, the rows running straight and true and at exactly the right drainage angle, because she had learned from yesterday, and because Harlan had checked her line twice without making her feel corrected. They ate lunch on her porch steps, side by side, with biscuits and salt pork she had warmed on the stove and a pot of coffee strong enough to stand on its own. Gerald came and stood at the corner of the porch and regarded them both with his customary expression of profound disillusionment. "He always looks like that?" Harlan asked. "Always," she confirmed. "I believe he was born disappointed. I find it oddly restful." "How?" "Because nothing I do makes it worse." Harlan laughed again, that same quiet, genuine laugh, and this time Clara let herself smile back at it fully rather than keeping it small, and something in the air between them shifted, the way the air shifts before rain, some fundamental change in pressure that the body notices before the mind catches up. The weeks after that settled into something that neither of them named. He rode over to check on her fence line one afternoon, and stayed to help her repair 3 posts that the recent wind had loosened. She brought over a pot of stew the following week, a practical thing with no ceremony attached to it, and he invited her in and they sat at his kitchen table and ate and talked for 2 hours, and when she left she felt something she had not felt in a considerable time, the specific lightness of an evening well spent. The people of Caldwell Crossing began to notice. This was inevitable. In a town the size of Caldwell Crossing, any deviation from established pattern was noticed within approximately 48 hours, documented within a week, and the subject of wide discussion shortly thereafter. Mrs. Agatha Perlow, who ran the general store with her husband Tobias and considered herself the administrative center of community affairs, was the first to say anything directly. She said it to Clara in March, while Clara was buying flour and a new hoe handle. "Mr. Brooks has been seen on your property 2 or 3 times, Mrs. Perlow said, with the air of someone passing along a scientific finding. "He helped me plow," Clara said, "and you have been seen on his." "I helped him plant the tomatoes," which was true. She had gone over the previous Saturday to help set out the seedlings from Annabelle's saved seeds, because it seemed right to follow a thing through. Mrs. Perlow studied her over the counter with eyes that missed nothing. "He is a good man," she said finally, which was high praise from Agatha Perlow. "He has not been the same since Annabelle, but I think," she paused, weighing something. "I think grief is not meant to be the end of things, only the middle of them." Clara paid for her flour and her hoe handle and said nothing, because she did not yet know what she thought, or rather she suspected she knew and was not entirely ready to say it even to herself. In April, there was a community barn raising for the Whitmore family, whose barn had gone down in a late storm, and the whole of Caldwell Crossing turned out, which meant about 40 adults and twice as many children, all descending on the Whitmore property with lumber and nails and food enough for an army. Clara came with her contribution of 2 pies and a determination to be useful, and Harlan came with his ranch hands, Eli and Pete Fogarty, who were large, affable men who worked hard and ate tremendous amounts. Clara found herself, by the mid-afternoon, working alongside Harlan on the roof section of the new structure, handing up boards while he nailed them, a rhythm of work that by now felt natural between them. Below them, the town moved and laughed and called to each other, and the whole scene had the feeling of a community assembled for its own best purposes, which was its own kind of beauty. "Your pie is famous already," Harlan told her, between boards, without looking down from his work. Eli had 2 pieces and is currently eyeing a third. "I put extra cinnamon in the apple," she said. "What is the other?" "Dried peach, my mother's recipe." He was quiet for a moment, driving in a nail with 3 clean strokes. "She sounds like she was a woman worth knowing." She was. She could make something out of nothing in a kitchen, and she could argue the back legs off any mule in East Texas, Gerald not excepted. Clara smiled. "I miss her every day, but in the way that feels like company rather than only absence. Does that make sense?" He looked down at her then from his position on the roof frame, the afternoon light behind him. "Yes," he said, and there was something in the word that suggested it made very specific and personal sense to him. "That is exactly how it is." The awareness of how it was built steadily between them through April and into May, like a structure being assembled from both ends toward the middle, each encounter adding something, each conversation leaving both of them with something to think about on the long evenings when the wind came down and the stars came up, and the panhandle revealed its nighttime character, which was immense and quiet and full of private conversation between the earth and the sky. In early May, one of Clara's fence posts on the north boundary gave way entirely, and 3 of her 4 pigs escaped through the gap and headed immediately toward Harlan's property with the purposeful determination that pigs reserve for mischief. She discovered this at sunrise and spent the next 2 hours chasing 3 intelligent, uncooperative animals across open ground, which was an experience that reduced dignity to approximately nothing. She had recovered 2 of them and was engaged in a complicated negotiation with the third, a large spotted sow named Mathilda who had opinions, when she became aware of Harlan arriving on Duke's back, moving at a brisk trot from the direction of his barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder. "Eli spotted them from the east field," he said, sliding down from the saddle. "Where is the third?" "That is Mathilda," Clara said, pointing, breathless from the chase. "She is just behind that brush stand. She went in and will not come out." Harlan looked at the brush stand, then at Clara, then at the brush stand again. He took the rope off his shoulder. "I am going to go around the south side and move her back toward you," he said. "When she comes out, just put your arms wide and walk steady. Do not chase her." "I know how to move a pig," Clara said with some spirit. "I know you do," he said, entirely without condescension, and went around the south side of the brush. Mathilda emerged from the north side approximately 2 minutes later, moving at a rolling, irritated trot, and Clara spread her arms and walked steadily, and Mathilda, confronted with the geometry of a determined woman and no available alternative, turned back toward home with an air of wounded pride. Harlan came around from the south, and they walked the pigs home together, which was not an activity that appeared in any romantic story Clara had ever heard, but which had a quality of shared ordinariness about it that she found, unexpectedly, rather wonderful. When you could share the unglamorous moments with someone and find them easy rather than embarrassing, that was something. They repaired the fence post together, working in easy companionable silence with a new post and fresh wire, and when it was done Harlan leaned on the top rail and looked across her north field, where the corn was beginning to come up in bright green rows, tentative and full of promise. "It is coming in well," he said. "I was worried about the early cold snap," she admitted, "but it held. Good strong seed. Where did you get it?" Bought it from Mr. Perlow. He gets it from a trader out of Amarillo. He nodded. I use the same seed. He paused. Your rows are better than last year. Last year being the first time I watched you plow, he said, and now there was something in his voice that was almost teasing, the dry edge of a man who has a sense of humor that comes out slowly, like water from deep in the ground. Which was also technically trespassing. Which was also technically effective, she said. He turned to look at her then, and they were close to the fence, closer than the work had strictly required, and he was looking at her in a way that was different from the way he usually looked at her, which was already careful and attentive. This was more open, more present, the way a man looks when he has stopped trying to look like he is not looking. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name just that, without the miss before it, and the sound of it in his voice did something complicated to the center of her chest. Yes, she said, which was not a complete sentence but felt like one. I would like to take you to supper, he said, at the hotel, properly. If you would agree to that. The hotel in Caldwell Crossing was the Territorial, which had a dining room that served actual meals on actual tablecloths on Saturday evenings, the only fine dining establishment within 40 miles. Going there with someone, being seen there together, was not a casual statement in a town the size of Caldwell Crossing. I would agree to that, she said. He exhaled slightly, as though he had been holding that breath for some time. Saturday. He put his hat back on, gathered Duke's reins, and swung back up into the saddle with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing it since before he could properly remember. He looked down at her from that height, and there was something in his face that was new, something that had not been there before this conversation, something that could only be called anticipation. Saturday, he said, confirming it, and rode back toward his property. Clara stood by the repaired fence and watched him go, and Gerald appeared at her elbow and breathed heavily on her arm, and she said to him quietly, Gerald, I believe something is happening. Gerald's expression did not change. But then it never did. The dinner at the Territorial was something. The dining room had 7 tables, and all 7 were occupied by Saturday night. And when Harlan Brooks arrived in a clean white shirt, and his good hat to collect Clara Reed, who had worn her blue dress and done her hair with the tortoiseshell pins her mother had left her, every eye in that dining room tracked them with the focused attention of an audience watching the second act. Clara sat across from Harlan at a corner table, with the oil lamp between them throwing its warm and slightly theatrical light, and she found that she was not nervous. She had expected to be nervous. Instead, she was simply very present, more present than she had been in some time, the way you are when something important is happening and you do not want to miss any of it. They talked through the entire meal, through the beef and potatoes and the surprisingly decent bread, through the coffee at the end. They talked about everything they had been circling around for weeks, the big questions that life on the frontier asked of people constantly, what you were building, what you were afraid of losing, what the land meant to you, not as an investment but as a kind of relationship, a thing that asked for your attention and rewarded it in ways you could not always predict. I used to think, Clara said, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, that coming here alone was a defeat, that a woman with land and no husband and no family nearby was a diminished thing. That is what the world suggested, at any rate. She looked up at him. I do not think that anymore. What do you think now? I think it takes a particular kind of strength to choose a hard thing and mean it. I think I am stronger than I knew, and I think the land did that partly. And she paused, considering. Certain people. He was looking at her with that open attention. Certain trespassing types, he said. The trespassing was strategic. It was effective, he agreed, and now he was smiling, a full genuine smile which transformed his face so completely that it was almost like seeing him for the first time. She thought, with the particular clarity of the moment, that she could look at that smile for a very long time without growing tired of it. They were the last people to leave the dining room. Mrs. Perlow, who had been dining with her husband at a table near the window, gave Clara a look as they left that contained approximately 14 separate pieces of information, all of them positive. Harlan walked her home, which was 1.5 miles, and they walked it slowly under a sky that was performing one of its best nighttime displays, the stars so thick and close in the clear panhandle air that they seemed almost to be within reach. At her gate, they stood for a moment in the particular gravity of an ending that does not want to end. "This was a fine evening," he said. "It was," she agreed. He was holding his hat in both hands again, which she had come to recognize as his tell, the thing he did when he was feeling something strongly and was not entirely certain what to do about it. He looked at her. "I would like," he said carefully, "for there to be more of them. More evenings, more of this, whatever this is." He seemed slightly frustrated with his own vocabulary, the way a precise man is frustrated when precision fails him. "More of talking to you, more of working alongside you, more of—" He stopped. "Yes," she said before he had to find the rest of it. He looked at her. "Yes to all of it. Yes to all of it." He put his hat back on with the air of a man who has completed something important and may now breathe normally. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Harlan." She watched him walk back down the road in the starlight, and she stood at her gate for a moment after he had gone, feeling the warm Texas night around her, and she was smiling in a way she could not have made herself stop even if she had wanted to. What followed was a summer of deepening that Clara would remember, in years to come, with the specific texture of real happiness, not the perfect happiness of stories where nothing goes wrong, but the true kind, where things go wrong and the person beside you is the reason it does not matter. They worked each other's land freely now, the boundary between their properties becoming more a formality than a barrier. Harlan taught her the creek-bottom drainage system he had engineered over a decade of observation, how to read the soil after rain, how to check the corn for the particular signs of drought stress before it became crisis. Clara taught him to make her mother's cornbread, which he ate 3 pieces of with a seriousness she found endearing, and she overhauled his root cellar organization system, which had been, by any reasonable standard, a disaster. She met Eli and Pete Fogarty properly in June, when they returned for the early summer cattle work. They were both big men in their mid-20s, Pete the older and the quieter, Eli the younger and so relentlessly cheerful that standing near him felt like standing in good weather. They were respectful and direct with her, which she appreciated, and they did not make anything of the fact that she knew her way around a farm better than men twice her experience, which she appreciated even more. "Harlan talks about you," Eli told her, one afternoon when they were mending the long south fence together and Harlan was occupied at the far end. He said it the way young men say things they consider significant facts, without ceremony. "Does he?" she said. "Not a lot. Just when things come up natural." Eli drove a staple into the post with one solid stroke. "He is not the kind of man that talks about anything a lot, but when he does mention it, the things he says about you are good." He said the word with simple finality as though it covered everything necessary. "You are a good friend to him," she said. "We come back every year," Eli said, which was his way of saying yes. July brought the longest dry stretch anyone in the county could remember since 1871. 3 weeks without rain, the Caprock shimmering with heat, the creek dropping to a fraction of its usual flow, the corn in every field beginning to show the rolled leaves of serious thirst. The whole county became focused on water with the intense, anxious attention of people who understand exactly what is at stake. Harlan and Clara worked together through the worst of it, hauling water from the creek at dawn and dusk to the most vulnerable sections of both properties, making decisions about what to save and what to sacrifice, which required a kind of brutal practicality that exhausted the body while keeping the mind ferociously alive. They were up before first light most mornings and did not stop until the light was gone, and sometimes in the deep heat of the afternoon, they would sit on the shaded porch of whichever property they were working and drink water from the same canteen and barely speak because the heat took words too, burned them off before they formed properly. One particular afternoon, in the white-hot middle of the third week, Clara sat on Harlan's porch and was very briefly, very quietly, overwhelmed. Not by any one thing, but by the accumulated weight of all the things, the dry corn, the thirst, the loneliness that had been her constant companion before she had found this unlikely community, the grief of her father and her mother and the East Texas farm left behind. She did not cry. She was not built for crying easily, but she pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the dry brown yard and felt the weight of it all at once. Harlan came out onto the porch with 2 cups of water and saw her face. He sat down beside her, not across from her but right beside her on the bench, their arms nearly touching in the breathless heat, and handed her one of the cups. "Tell me," he said. So she did. Not all of it, not the full inventory of loss and loneliness, but enough that he understood the shape of it. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, which was what she needed, the simple presence of someone who was not going to look away from the difficult parts. When she had said what there was to say, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know what it is to feel like you are the only person holding a thing together. I know what that weight is." He paused. "You are not holding it alone anymore. I want you to know that." She looked at him. The heat was absolute around them, and the ranch was still and dust dry, and the world outside felt very far away. "I know," she said. "That is why I was crying. Not because I am alone, because I realized I am not." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He reached over and took her hand, just held it, steady and warm in the crushing July heat. They sat like that for several minutes, saying nothing, and it was one of the most complete things Clara had ever experienced. The rain came the following week, a proper panhandle thunderstorm that rolled in from the northwest with a wall of dark cloud and a wind that smelled of lightning and wet earth. And it rained for 18 hours straight, a drenching, thorough, magnificent rain that saved the corn and refilled the creek and left the world afterward looking cleaner and greener and somehow rebuilt. Clara stood on her porch in the aftermath, watching the steam rising off the dark, saturated earth, and felt something very like joy. Later that same week, Harlan came to her door in the evening, which was not unusual by this point, but his manner was different. He had his good hat on, which he usually only wore for town visits, and he was holding something in his hands that he transferred from one hand to the other twice before she noticed it. It was a ring. Small, simple, a thin gold band with a tiny blue stone set in it, the stone the color of the Texas sky in the clear October weeks before winter. He was holding it as carefully as he had held everything important, which was to say, with both hands and complete attention. "I have thought about how to say this properly for 2 weeks," he said, standing on her porch, "and I cannot improve on the plain version, so I will give you that." Clara stood in her doorway, and her heart was making a noise in her chest that she was certain must be audible. "I love you," Harlan said. "I did not think I would again. I thought that kind of thing happened once and was over and you just went on with the rest of your life. I was wrong. You came through my fence and plowed my field and argued with me about what constitutes trespassing, and I fell in love with you completely, and I cannot imagine my days without you in them." He held up the ring. "I would like very much for you to marry me if you want to. I understand completely if you need more time or if—" "Yes," Clara said. He stopped. "You are certain?" "I have been certain for quite some time," she said. "I was just waiting to see if you were going to figure it out." He laughed, and she laughed too, and he came up the porch steps, and she took the ring from his hand and looked at it in the fading evening light. "The blue stone," she said. "Matches your dress," he said. "The one you wore to dinner at the Territorial." She looked up at him. "You remember the color of my dress?" "I remember everything about that evening," he said simply. She let him put the ring on her finger, and then he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her. And it was nothing like what Clara had read about in the romantic novels she had occasionally borrowed from Mrs. Perlow's personal library. It was better than that. It was specific and warm and full of everything that had built between them. All the plowing and the fence repairs and the pig wrangling and the drought and the conversations and the silences. It was all of it, and it was exactly right. They were married in October of 1874, in the church that was also the schoolhouse, on a clear morning with the Caprock burning gold on the horizon and the cottonwoods along the creek blazing yellow and red. The entire town of Caldwell Crossing was there, which amounted to around 60 adults, all dressed in their best, all of whom seemed to have opinions about the seating arrangements that the Reverend Mr. Hollies managed with patient diplomatic skill. Eli and Pete Fogarty were both there, scrubbed and buttoned up and clearly somewhat uncomfortable in their good clothes, but grinning with genuine warmth. Eli cried during the vows, which he subsequently denied with great vigor to anyone who raised the subject. Mrs. Agatha Perlow sat in the front row with the proprietary satisfaction of a woman who feels she has had a hand in the outcome of events, which was not entirely false. Her husband Tobias sat beside her and looked quietly pleased for everyone involved. Clara wore the blue dress, because it seemed right, and Harlan looked at her when she came down the aisle between the packed pews with an expression that made several of the older women in the congregation exchange wordless glances of the most satisfied kind. They spoke their vows in the clear, carrying voice of people who mean them, and when the Reverend Hollies pronounced them married and Harlan kissed her again in front of the entire assembled town, the cheer that went up was loud enough to startle the horses tied at the rail outside. The celebration afterward, in the yard of the church where tables had been set up, and more food appeared than seemed physically possible from a community this size, was one of those afternoons that gets remembered in a town for a generation. Music from a fiddle and a guitar, dancing on the hard dirt yard, children running between the adults' legs, Gerald the mule tied to the fence at the edge of the yard, radiating his customary philosophically gloom, which provided something of a counterpoint to the general festivity. Clara danced with Harlan 3 times. During the second dance, which was slower, a waltz of sorts played on the fiddle by old Mr. Atwater, who had learned it somewhere impossibly far away. She said to him quietly, "Are you happy?" "Unreasonably so," he said, which was the most Harlan Brooks answer possible. "Good," she said. "Me too." They moved their households together in the practical way of frontier people, Clara's belongings joining Harlan's in the timber house, her 3 trunks of her mother's things finding places in rooms that were large enough and warm enough and needed, in Clara's view, somewhat more color, which she set about providing with cheerful determination. Gerald was installed in the barn where he and Solomon regarded each other with mutual suspicion for approximately 1 week, before settling into a cautious coexistence that was, as these things went, relatively harmonious. Clara took charge of the kitchen and the kitchen garden, which she expanded as Annabelle had planned, with fruit trees in the southeast corner and a well dug close, because the plan had been a good one and deserved executing. Harlan did not comment on this directly, but one evening he came to stand at the kitchen garden fence and looked at the young peach trees Clara had planted, the same kind Annabelle had wanted, and his expression had in it something that was not quite sadness and not quite gratitude and was probably both. "They will bear in 3 years," Clara told him, standing beside him. "3 years is nothing," he said, and he took her hand, and they stood there while the evening settled over the property, and the past and the present occupied the same ground without conflict, the way they can when people carry them honestly. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was cold and long, the way Texas Panhandle winters were, with blue northers that came down without warning and ice on the creek and weeks of weather that drove everything and everyone inside. Clara found that she did not mind, which surprised her slightly. She had always been an outdoor person, a person who chafed at confinement. But the evenings by the fire with Harlan, talking or reading or simply sitting in companionable quiet, were their own kind of fullness. He was, she discovered in the particular intimacy of a shared winter, an unexpectedly tender man. He was not given to large demonstrations. He did not speak in extravagant terms. but he was consistently and quietly attentive in ways that accumulated over time into something more substantial than any grand gesture, the way small stones build a solid wall. He noticed when she was tired and took things from her without being asked. He remembered what she said, all of it, with the accuracy of a man who genuinely listened. He made her coffee the way she liked it before she was awake enough to make it herself. He told her things gradually that she understood he did not tell easily. About Annabelle, about the years of grief, about the way he had kept himself busy and functional and essentially sealed against anything that might crack the seal, until Clara had come through his fence with a borrowed plow and a completely unapologetic expression, and had declined to be managed. "You were the thing I did not see coming," he told her one winter evening, and it was clear he meant it as the highest possible form of praise. "You were not easy," she said truthfully. "I know." A pause. "Thank you for not caring." She laughed. "I cared. I just cared about the right things." Spring came again, as it does, with the particular violence and beauty of Panhandle springs, the wind and the wildflowers and the impossibly blue sky and the earth waking up with its usual lack of apology for having slept so long. Clara planted her kitchen garden with a satisfaction that had multiple layers to it. The seeds she had saved herself, the peach and apple trees she had planted the previous fall, the tomatoes from the seeds Harlan had given her the first morning they had worked together, which she had been saving and replanting carefully, and which were now, she was confident, the finest tomato seedlings in the county. In March of 1875, she told Harlan that they were going to have a baby. He was at the fence, repairing a section that had gone loose over the winter, and he had a hammer in one hand and a staple between his teeth, and she told him. And he took the staple out of his teeth very carefully and set the hammer down and turned to look at her with an expression that she was certain she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was the kind of look that did not have a word, the look of a man who has been given something he stopped hoping for and cannot quite reconcile himself with his own luck. "Clara," he said. "November, I think," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and held her, both arms, properly held her, with the full and uncomplicated commitment of someone who is not holding anything back. She felt his breath in her hair and his heart going at a slightly faster rate than usual, and she held on in return, and the spring wind moved around them both, and the Panhandle was vast and indifferent and beautiful and full of everything. The pregnancy was not romantic in the practical sense, which is to say it was hard work, because everything on the frontier was hard work, and being physically uncomfortable while also keeping 40 acres of farmland from going to seed required a certain determined creativity. Clara continued to work because work needed doing, and she was a woman who worked. She modified what she lifted and how she moved, and she listened carefully to Dr. Emmett Price, the territory doctor who rode a circuit through the county every 2 weeks, and who had delivered most of the children in Caldwell, crossing currently old enough to run between adults' legs at celebrations. Harlan managed what she would let him manage and did not manage what she would not, and this balance, which was somewhat delicate and required occasional renegotiation, worked primarily because they talked to each other directly about what was needed and were both, when it came down to it, more interested in good outcomes than in winning the argument. The Fogarty brothers returned for summer season and treated Clara with the kind of careful, warm attentiveness of men who understand that something important and fragile is occurring and want to be useful about it without being intrusive. Eli brought her wildflowers one afternoon, a large and slightly anarchic bouquet that he presented with profound awkwardness and absolute sincerity, and which she put in a jar on the kitchen windowsill where they lasted until the petals fell. The summer was easier than the last one, the rains more regular, the corn coming in thick and dark, the kitchen garden producing in such excess that Clara was putting up preserves by the late weeks of August with a diligence that filled the root cellar to its reorganized capacity. The peach trees were too young to bear, but the tomatoes were extravagant, deep red and perfect, and she ate them warm from the vine with salt and thought about the seeds that had been kept through 3 years of grief in an old paper parcel, and about the woman who had saved them, and about how things continued even when you could not see quite how they would. On a clear November morning, with the caprock gone to its autumn bronze and the cottonwoods mostly bare along the creek, their son was born. He was, by Dr. Price's assessment, a healthy, loud, and thoroughly opinionated baby who arrived at dawn with considerable energy and wasted none of it being quiet about his preferences. Clara held him while the morning light came through the bedroom window and felt that particular, overwhelming quiet that comes after the enormous noise of bringing a person into the world. Harlan sat on the edge of the bed, his hand covering both of Clara's, looking at the baby with an expression of absolute wonder, the kind of wonder that a man shows when he has fully run out of the composed reserve he usually carries everywhere and has nothing left but feeling. "What do we name him?" Clara asked, though they had talked about names before and she already knew what she hoped. "James," he said, "for your father." Her father's name had been James Reed. She had mentioned it once in passing months ago and he had remembered. She looked up at him. She could not speak for a moment, so she did not, and the silence said everything it needed to. "James Brooks," she said finally. "James Brooks," he agreed, and his voice was rough in the way voices are when something has gotten past the guard. James Brooks grew, as babies do, with remarkable speed and thorough indifference to anyone's sense of time. He was a solid, cheerful, dark-haired boy who began attempting to walk at 9 months with a determination that reminded everyone who knew her of his mother. He was fascinated by the horses and terrified of absolutely nothing, which Harlan observed with equal parts pride and anxiety, as fathers do. The following spring, when James was taking his first uncertain steps around the kitchen, Clara was in the kitchen garden when she heard a wagon coming up the main track. She straightened, shading her eyes, and saw that it was not a familiar vehicle. A farm wagon, loaded with goods, driven by a man she did not recognize, with a woman sitting beside him, and 2 children visible in the wagon bed. They pulled up at the main road gate and the man climbed down, hat in hand, with the manner of someone arriving at a destination they have been traveling toward for a long time and are not certain how to present themselves. "Beg your pardon," the man said. He was perhaps 35, weathered and honest-looking, with a wife who was watching from the wagon with quiet, exhausted eyes. "We are looking for the Brooks property." "You have found it," Clara said. "I am Thomas Hadley. This is my wife Ruth. We have just come from Missouri. We are looking to file on land in this county. We heard," he paused, "we heard there was a woman here who could help newcomers get started. Mrs. Brooks," they said. Clara looked at him, then at Ruth Hadley, who was watching her now with the specific expression of a woman who has traveled very far and is in need of something she does not quite want to ask for directly. Clara knew that expression. She had worn it herself 2 years ago, standing at her father's grave in the East Texas clay and telling herself she was going to be all right. "Come in," she said. "I will put coffee on. Harlan will be back from the creek by noon, and he knows every parcel still available in this county." Ruth Hadley climbed down from the wagon and took Clara's hand with both of hers, briefly, firmly, the handshake of one practical woman to another, and Clara felt the particular, clear pleasure of having become a person who was useful to someone standing at the beginning of their hard and promising new life. When Harlan came in from the creek at noon, he found his kitchen occupied by 2 adults and 2 children ranging in age from 6 to about 3, with James contributing his perspective from the floor at everyone's feet, and Clara at the stove managing a full midday meal with the calm authority of a woman in complete command of her domain. He took all of this in from the doorway. His eyes found Clara's and she gave him a small, plain look that communicated something in the private language of people who have been paying attention to each other for 2 years, which was essentially, "Trust me, this is important. Sit down." He sat down. He talked to Thomas Hadley through the meal, and he knew the available parcels as Clara had said he would, and he sketched a rough map on the back of an old bill and marked 3 possible claims. And by the time the coffee was finished, Thomas Hadley had the information he needed and Ruth Hadley had the address of the midwife in town, and the name of the preacher who was also the schoolmaster, and the name of Mrs. Perlow at the general store who would know everything else. After the Hadley family drove away, Harlan stood at the gate and watched them go, then turned back to where Clara was collecting the cups from the porch railing. "You fed 4 strangers lunch," he observed. "I fed 4 neighbors lunch," she corrected. "They just have not lived here long enough to know it yet." He looked at her for a moment with that open, unreserved look she had come to know as his version of saying everything at once. "I love you," he said, in the direct way he had, which never lost its force by repetition because he only said it when he meant it and he always meant it entirely. "I love you too," she said. "Come help me get the peas in this afternoon. The garden will not plant itself. Would you like to ask permission first or just start?" She gave him a look of profound and composed patience. He was smiling. She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught. They went back to work. The years layered themselves one over another with the accumulating richness of a life lived with intention in a place that demanded nothing less. The Hadleys settled on the parcel north of the Whitmore property and became the kind of neighbors who appeared with tools when tools were needed and with food when food was needed, which was the best kind. Ruth Hadley and Clara developed a friendship of the solid, unornamented variety, built on shared work and direct conversation, and the occasional afternoon sitting on whoever's porch was shadiest, letting the children run in the yard while they talked about the things women talk about when they trust each other fully. James began walking with confidence at 11 months and began talking at 12, with a vocabulary that suggested he had been listening to everything said around him since birth and had simply been waiting until he had enough material to work with. He was a serious and affectionate small person, dark like his father and stubborn like his mother, and Harlan loved him with the particular intensity of a man who had not expected to have this, and therefore did not take a single morning of it for granted. The kitchen garden grew as the peach trees grew, adding structure and permanence to the property, the way planted things do when they are tended with care over seasons. The peach trees bore their first fruit in the spring of 1877, small and sweet, and abundantly more than 2 peaches Clara had expected from young trees, and she made preserves of them and gave jars to everyone she could think of and ate the rest directly, standing in the garden in the afternoon sun with juice running down her wrist, which was, she thought, a good way to eat a peach. She told Harlan that evening, standing at the gate of the kitchen garden in the long spring light, that she wanted to expand the land, file on an additional claim to the south of her original 40 acres, which was still available, and which would give them a full 140 acres to work between the properties. He considered this with the thoroughness he brought to all practical questions, which she had come to appreciate because it meant that when he agreed to something he had actually thought it through and not simply agreed to be agreeable. "We would need to take on another hand," he said. 2 during cattle season, possibly. "Pete Fogarty mentioned his cousin was looking for steady work," she said. "Eli said he is reliable. I know the man, Jesse Fogarty, he is reliable." A pause. "You already talked to Eli." "I gathered information," she said pleasantly. He looked at her with a combination of exasperation and admiration that had become one of her favorite expressions on his face. "Of course you did." He looked out over the south pasture, calculating. "File the claim. We will make it work." She did. The claim went through in June of 1877, and they broke the additional land through the summer, a bigger job than anything they had tackled before, with Jesse Fogarty adding his considerable energy and Eli and Pete both staying past cattle season to help get the new section ready for the following year's planting. There were long days and late suppers, and once a stretch of a week where Harlan and Jesse worked from first to last light, and Clara kept pace with them in the kitchen garden while simultaneously managing James, who at 2 was fully mobile and deeply committed to personal exploration without adult supervision. One evening during that week, with James finally asleep and the supper things cleared, and the night coming in through the open window with the cooling air and the sound of the creek in the distance, Clara sat at the kitchen table and rubbed her hands, which were stiff from the day's work. Harlan came and sat across from her and took both her hands in his and rubbed them with the steady, practical attention of a man who has learned exactly where the tension sits. She closed her eyes briefly and let the tiredness be what it was without fighting it. "Tell me something good," she said. It was a thing she sometimes asked in the hard weeks, a private practice. He thought for a moment. "The northwest section of the new claim," he said. "The soil is even better than ours. Creek silt from an old channel, deep and dark. Pete says it is the best bottom land he has seen since Missouri." She opened her eyes. "That is something good. James said 3 new words today. I heard him. He said horse, fence, and mine." "Mine," she said, "is possibly a word we should not celebrate too vigorously. He said it about the horse." "Still," Harlan smiled. "And you are here," he said. "That is the best thing." She looked at him across the table in the lamplit kitchen of the house that had been mostly his when she first came into it, and was now entirely theirs, with her mother's things on the shelves and the tortoiseshell pins in the dish by the mirror, and the tomato seedlings in the window and Annabelle's recipe book on the shelf, next to the one her own mother had written by hand in careful letters. The 2 women occupying the same space with no conflict because love does not run out. "You are not so bad yourself," she told him. "High praise from the woman who trespassed on my property." "Strategically," she said. "Strategically," he agreed. He was still holding her hands, and the night was soft outside, and James was sleeping in the next room, and the land they had built together was lying all around them in the dark, ready for morning. In the autumn of 1877, Clara told him she was pregnant again. She told him this time at the kitchen table over breakfast, directly and without preamble, and watched his face do the same thing it had done the first time, though with perhaps slightly more certainty in it now, the wonder of a man who knows this is possible but is still astonished that it is happening again. "When?" he asked. "April or May, Dr. Price thinks." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "better than last time so far." He looked at her with that complete attention she had come to think of as one of his gifts, the gift of being truly looked at by someone who saw all of it, the competent and the tired and the joyful and the practical, and found all of it worth the looking. "I am glad," he said simply. Their daughter arrived in late April of 1878, on a morning when the wildflowers were running across the caprock in waves of yellow and red and blue, and the whole wide panhandle smelled of rain and new growth. She was small and determined and immediately loud, and her eyes, when she opened them and fixed them on whoever was nearest, were the same autumn creek color as her father's. They named her May, for the month she had decided to arrive in early, and for the quality of the month itself, the particular promising quality of something beginning. James, at 3½ approached his sister with the air of a small person conducting a careful investigation. He studied her for a long time. Then he announced his verdict. "She is little," he said. "She is," Clara agreed. "I was little too," he said, apparently finding some philosophical comfort in this continuity. "You were," Harlan said. "You were also very loud." James thought about this. "Is she loud?" "She is louder than you were," Clara said, which was the truth. James considered his sister again with what appeared to be growing respect. The 4 of them grew into the life, the way families do, with the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of days that are sometimes hard and sometimes easy, and are the shape of a shared life when all of them are lived in the same direction. The panhandle remained itself, vast and demanding and intermittently magnificent, asking for everything and sometimes giving more than you expected. Gerald the mule lived to an improbable old age and retired from any form of work in 1879, with a dignity that suggested he had been waiting for this moment for some time. He spent his final years in the pasture near Solomon, the two of them standing in comfortable proximity in the afternoons, which Clara found more touching than she would readily admit, and which she pointed out to Harlan as evidence that even the most opinionated individuals eventually find their people. "Are you talking about the mule," he said, "or about yourself?" "Harlan," she said, "I have never been as difficult as Gerald." He looked at her with 8 years of married life in his expression and said, very wisely, "Nothing at all." The Hadley family grew and settled. The Whitmore family rebuilt and expanded. Caldwell Crossing added a proper hotel with 4 rooms and a post office that operated 3 days a week. And the general growth of the county brought new families in every spring, some of whom found their way to the Brooks property in the way that people find their way toward a place they have heard is welcoming, which it was. Clara helped 3 families get started on their claims in 1879 alone, lending seed and tools and the kind of specific practical knowledge that cannot be found in any book, because it lives only in the experience of someone who has actually done the thing. She sat with Ruth Hadley and 2 other women in the county and organized the first formal exchange of seeds and techniques among the homesteading families, a practical sharing that kept the best varieties moving through the community rather than being lost when a single family struggled. Harlan watched all of this with the particular pride of a man who chose well and knows it, and who understands that what he chose was not a woman who would fit herself to the space he had made, but a woman who would expand the space itself. He told her so, one evening in the fall of 1879, when James was 5 and May was 18 months old, and both of them were finally, against the odds, asleep at the same time, and Clara was sitting on the front porch in the October evening with a cup of coffee, watching the caprock go pink and gold in the sunset. He sat beside her, the same bench they had shared since the beginning, and he said, "I think about the morning you came through my fence sometimes." "Do you?" she said. "I was so certain I was right," he said, "about not having a woman work my land, about the proper order of things, about what was appropriate and what was not." He paused. "I had arranged everything very carefully." "I know," she said. "Then you just—" He made a small gesture toward the south field, visible in the fading light, full and dark and productive, the rows running at the correct angle because she had learned from him how to read the land and he had learned from her what it meant to actually believe in what you were building. "You just started." "The work needed doing," she said. "The work needed doing," he agreed. "And you knew things I did not, and I knew things you did not, and between the 2 of us," he looked out at the land. "Between the 2 of us, we built something that neither of us would have built alone." Clara set down her coffee cup. She looked at the caprock, burning its last gold for the day before the Texas night came in with its full inventory of stars. She looked at her hands, brown and capable, wearing the thin gold ring with the small blue stone. She looked at Harlan Brooks, who was 37 now and had a few more threads of gray, and who looked at her with the steady, complete attention of a man who has been paying attention for 5 years and intends to continue indefinitely. "You were worth trespassing on," she told him. He laughed, that quiet, genuine laugh that still changed his face exactly the way it always had. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and the evening came down around the property, the horses in the barn and the children sleeping and the land lying still in every direction, all of it theirs, built from 2 people and a borrowed plow, and the particular, unreasonable, entirely logical decision of a woman who had somewhere important to be and did not intend to ask permission for getting there. The stars came out over the Texas panhandle one by one and then all at once, the way they always did, in their thousands, filling the wide dark with their ancient indifferent beauty, and below them the Brooks Ranch sat quiet and sure as anything that has been honestly built, the timber house with its warm lamplight, the kitchen garden with its peach trees now bearing full and sweet, the long south field that had started everything, the fence line that was no longer much of a boundary at all. And Clara Reed Brooks sat on her porch under all those stars, and held the life she had made with both hands, the life she had plowed into being against any reasonable expectation. And it was full and warm and exactly what it was supposed to be, which is the only definition of a good life anyone has ever been able to honestly give. May cried once in the small hours, and Clara went in and nursed her back to sleep and stood over James's bed in the moonlight for a moment, watching him sleep with the abandoned completeness of a healthy child. And then she went back to Harlan, who was still half awake, and he said, "Everything all right?" "Everything is all right," she said. He pulled her close in the dark of the room, and the wind moved outside and the creek ran in the distance, and the panhandle held them all in its enormous, indifferent arms. And it was the truth. Everything was all right. Everything was better than all right. It was a good life, built from work and stubbornness, and the willingness of two people to see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. And it would go on from this good autumn evening forward into all the mornings that were waiting, full of everything still to come. The fields and the children, and the long, useful days, and the evenings on the porch, and the accumulated ordinary, extraordinary weight of two people building something true together in the wild and beautiful country that had given them both exactly what they had earned. In the spring of 1880, James helped his father plant the corn for the first time, small hands on the plow handle, dark eyes serious with the weight of the task. And Harlan stood behind him and guided without taking over. And Clara watched from the fence and thought about a morning 6 years ago when she had come through a gap in a different fence with a borrowed plow, and a mule named Gerald, and a determination that the work needed doing regardless of what anyone thought about who was doing it. She thought about how that morning had contained everything that came after it, the way a seed contains the tree. And she thought that some things that look like stubbornness from the outside are actually just clarity, knowing what you need and going directly toward it without making apologies for the path you take. James reached the end of the first row and turned, with his father's help, to start the second, and the furrow behind him ran straight and true as a line drawn by someone who means what they are doing, and the panhandle spring spread out all around them in every direction, enormous and warm and full of everything beginning. Clara pushed off from the fence and went to join them, because that was what you did with the things that were yours. You showed up for them every morning and put your hands to them, and did not let the work wait, because waiting never made anything easier, and the land had never once asked whether she had the right kind of name or the right kind of history or the right kind of permission. The land only ever asked one thing, and she had always known the answer. "Are you here?" Yes, she was. She was here, standing in the spring light of the Texas Panhandle in the year 1880, with mud on her boots and her husband's shoulder within reach and her son's laughter coming across the newly turned field and her daughter's voice from somewhere inside the house, calling for no particular reason that anyone could determine, just calling, just saying that she was there too, just adding her voice to all of it. And Clara Brooks tilted her face up to the blue and boundless sky and let herself feel the full weight of everything she had built, everything she was, everything that was still to come. And it was good. It was so very good. It was exactly enough and more besides.